Permanece atentado y mantenga las manos, brazos, pies y piernas dentro del tren y cuide a los pequeños.
On today's Throwback Thursday video, we're taking a trip back in time. The year will be 2013, and we will be revisiting the Walt Disney World Railroad, the magic behind our steam trains tours. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
my train today. So we're going into the jungles of Adventureland. This is like a two-edged sword for these trains. It's where Walt's favorite attraction is located. Anybody get an idea what that was? Jungle Cruise, absolutely. And it's like a breath of fresh air for these locomotives to go back in the jungles because that's where they came from. They worked on a small railroad called the United Railways of Yucatan in Mexico. They called some passenger work, but most of the work was freight. And the freight contained sugarcane and hemp fibers. They would bring the hemp fibers from the jungles and transport them out to a port on the east coast of Mexico called Sisal, where they were manufactured into very strong rope that is now called Sisal rope. That's where it got its name. They painted on hand the name of the town on the side of the crates, and that's where the rope got its name from. We're going to be going through the first of our crossings here. This is the Adventureland crossing. This is when we bring our floats across for our parades. We are the railroad is control, but the movement of those floats to get lined up with the parades. About 5 parades a day here. We're going to get to look at one of our hidden Mickeys here right after the crossing. It's on my right, your left. It's going to be on the ground here, right next to the signal tower. Right there. So, how many of you guys have been on the Pirates of the Caribbean? Everybody. How about you, Erwin? You've been on there, right? Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know where the boat makes the dive down into the darkness and splashes into the water? You know why? Because it's going underneath our tracks. 50% of the attraction is right there. The other 50% is over here. They built it after the railroad was built. They needed to get around this, so they went underneath this. We go underneath this in the middle of this tunnel. So what do we call this tunnel, Erwin? Pirates Tunnel. There we go. This is the location of our Frontierland station. It was a gingerbread style station. In 1990, when they decided to build Splash, they tore it down, and in 1992 they opened up the Frontierland station on the opposite side of the attraction. On my right, your left, inside this gate right here, that green building down there at the bottom of the hill, that's our parade float station building. That's where all our parade floats are maintained and stored, and there is a lot of them. That building's about the size of 2.5 football fields. We're going to the middle of the Splash here. This is under construction right now. There's a refurbishment going on. We're not exactly sure what the date of reopening is. But we can see our new, if you haven't been here a while, that's Frontierland Station. It has a western theming. It goes a little bit better with the theming of the park area. You're going to get a sneak peek at the roundhouse and swing bridge for Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. The building down there with the spotlight on it. That's their roundhouse. They swing bridge right alongside our tracks. They swing it across our tracks and bring their trains into the attraction across the way in the morning and bring them back in the evening. And of course, their bridge system is interlocked with our signaling system so that we don't ever meet. But into the attraction itself is a mining town called Tumbleweed in Arizona. They had a drought, so they hired Cumulus Isobar, the rainmaker, to fix that drought. He does such a great job, he washes the entire town away. We're going to be going over a piece of railroading history now. This is an actual swing bridge from the Flagler Railroad. The Flagler Railroad went from Central Florida all the way to Key West. This was the bridge that survived the hurricane and wiped out everything in that particular area. This is still an operating swing bridge. We swing the bridge out of the way so that our riverboat can go over to the dry dock area. It takes about 7 hours to open and close that bridge. It takes 3 very large men with a big T-handle key to operate the gearbox that rotates that bridge out of the way. We're entering a 2% downhill grade now. A little bit later on we'll talk about 2%, but most of the people here today I think are all rail fans, so they got an idea what 2% really means. We'll talk about it less. But this area is fondly known by the rail crew as the backstretch. We see a lot of wildlife back here that isn't plastic. We see mama deer and baby deer out here every season. Mama deer teaching the babies how to stay away from the train. We see fox back here. There's some right there. We see otters back here. We see wild turkeys. Of course, over the wetlands over here, we see little reptiles called alligators. Yes, they are native to this area. We have a new one, actually, it's not so new anymore, right? Erwin, he's about 5 feet now. Up on the bridge there, correct. So let's talk a little bit about our locomotives, where they came from. In 1966, one of the last things Walt was early 65. One of the things Walt was involved with was the commission of building this railroad. He wanted existing locomotives purchased for this railroad, unlike Disneyland, where they began to build them from scratch. So they began a search, and they searched till 1969 and couldn't find anything in refurbishable condition. Until the report came in from an avid rail photographer and journalist named Jerry Best. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? He took pictures, locomotive pictures for Trains magazine. He just happened to be on vacation in Mexico and just happened to stumble upon the rail yard, the bone yard of the United Railways of the Yucatan, where he found a virtual Disneyland of all the locomotives just rusting away. He took some photographs of these locomotives and got some maintenance logs from the railroad and shipped that information up to a gentleman in California named Roger Brody. Roger Brody will become Walt's lifelong railroad buddy and the man behind the rebirth of our locomotives here and the locomotives in Disneyland. We're going to talk a lot about Roger a little bit later. The train that's pulling us is actually named for him. Roger hops and his team of Imagineers hop on a plane, they fly to Mexico, they find the first two 10-wheelers that we have, then they find the 440, and then they find the Mogul. Now that has to do with the wheel configurations of the different locomotives. We'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later in detail. In 1969, what do you think he paid for each one of those locomotives? They were in bad shape, so $10 million. This is our steam generator. We take steam from the boiler, pump it back here. It spins the turbine on the other side, which is connected to the shaft, and rotates that generator inside. That creates the power we need for our lights, for our safety systems, for the spiels that you listen to from station to station, and a computer that monitors them. Now, we do something very interesting with the exhaust from this particular turbine. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. I need to take a couple pictures of this, and then I can close it up. Even though I started the rear of the tender, our non-rail suave guests, the tender is what we would maybe refer to as the coal car, or that's where we keep the wood on these particular locomotives and the water, and this is the locomotive. The reason we call that the tender back there is because it tends to the locomotive's needs. So I usually start right here with the locomotive portion. What do we call this? The cow catcher. Everybody knows that, right? But inside these gates, we call it the proper rail term, which is called the pilot. The reason we call it the pilot, the proper rail term, the ideas or images that come around the phrase cow catcher bring on some images that we don't like to think about around here, but there is a reason that it is painted red, and we just end the story there. So, that's attached to this particular deck. We call that the pilot deck, and it covers over these two little wheels in the front. So what do you think we call those wheels? Pilot wheels, absolutely. Since you could navigate the radiuses or turns around the park, gives us a nice smooth ride. Well, let's talk a little bit about how the locomotive works. Does anybody have a teapot at home? Sure. Well, this is my teapot. Well, one of my teapots, except that I'm making tractive effort and not hot chocolate or tea. So how does it work? This red area right here is our boiler. Inside that boiler is something called flutes or tubes. Different manufacturers call them different things. They're about 1.5 inches in diameter, and they're about 30, on this one, about 30 feet long. And there's about 174 of them. What that does, it takes the heat and products of combustion from the firebox, which is back here, pulls it forward, And as that heat is pulled through these tubes, there is water in the boiler. Those are all encompassed by water. The heat is then conducted to the water. The water begins to pick up temperature, it begins to churn, and at 212 degrees it begins to make steam. Well, our steam is a lot warmer than 212 degrees. But once that steam does accumulate, is produced, it accumulates in the larger of the two domes called the steam dome. Now, how does all that heat and products of combustion get drawn forward to this area right here? Well, in this area right here, we have something called a stack blower. It's a ring about this big around, has all holes in the top, and we pump steam to that particular device, and it shoots steam up the stack. As it goes up the stack, it begins to swirl and creates a draft. Now, anybody have a fireplace at home? Okay, when you don't have a good draft with the fireplace, what happens?
Smoked out of the house.
It comes into the house, the smoke alarms go off, we have to make dinner for the fire department, it's a mess, right? So that's what assists us with pulling that products of combustion and efficiently changing or pulling that heat into those tubes and conducting to the water, which is going to make our steam. This is our smoke box right here. Our tubes basically terminate right here, and the water terminates right here. Inside here, this is where the products of combustion from the firebox and the exhaust from the steam pistons accumulates and vents up and out the stack. Basically, every appliance that we have on the locomotive, the exhaust steam will eventually end up in the smoke box and exit the stack. So, as that steam is boiled and turned and we create a head pressure up inside the steam dome, you pull back on the throttle. The throttle is basically the gas pedal of the locomotive, and it opens up a valve inside there. The steam then enters something called a dry pipe. The reason we call it the dry pipe is because it's dry steam. Yes, there is a difference between wet steam and dry steam. We get more of I'm not going to go into the deep end of the pool. I said I'd keep this nice and simple. So, that steam, that pipe comes down here, goes all the way through the boiler again, and then comes to here. When it gets here, it lies off like this. One goes down and feeds the piston on the engineer side, the other one comes down and feeds the piston on this side, on the fireman's. Before it goes into that piston, however, it needs to go through this device right here. This is called the steam chest. Inside the steam chest is a valve. A valve called a D valve. The reason they call it a D valve is sort of shaped like the letter D. What it does, it travels horizontally, similar to the piston. This is the cylinder, and inside is the piston. The same type of piston is sort of in your car. So what happens is, this particular valve operates the exact opposite positioning of the main drive piston. And what that allows it to do is that this valve, traveling back and forth here, either opens or closes the ports that allow the steam to enter or vent off and exit from the piston, which moves it back and forth. So right now, for instance, if we looked at the piston ram right here, it's about half of it's probably sticking out here, nice and shiny. So that tells me that my piston is almost about midway on the cylinder. But for our demonstrative purposes, let's say, for instance, that our piston is all the way to the rear. So that would mean that our D valve is all the way to the front. So what it will do is, as the steam comes down, the ports in the front of the cylinder are blocked. So the steam comes down, routes to the rear of this piston, pushes the piston forward. As it pushes it forward through the linkage, which is the Stephenson's linkage, which is the exact same linkage that Mr. Stephenson used in the 1800s for his invention of the steam locomotive, through this linkage, will actually cause that piston, when pushing this piston forward, the D valve will come to the back. As it comes to the back, it allows this residual that's in the front to vent up and out of the stack, and then the next stroke will allow the steam to come in, hit the front of the piston, and push it backwards. So, sweetheart, let me see, my hands are nice and clean now. Can I borrow your hands just for a minute? Okay, most people think locomotives do this, okay? No, they do this. Notice, in school, wheels on the train go round and round and round and round. You done? You ready? Doing your Pilates today? All right. I love holding hands with good-looking women. So, by the way, you have a lovely daughter. That's basically how they work. And you'll see, for instance, that our main piston is attached to the main drive arm And then this rod connects these two drive wheels together, so that rod is called the connecting rod. So we have the drive rod, and the one that connects the other two in the back is the connecting rod. So you'll see my theory by you look at the location of the connecting rod and drive rod that's on this side. When we go around the other side, you'll see that they'll be in a different position. Okay? You'll also take a look at the ram on the piston. It will be exposed in a different locale. Now, let's talk about some of the appliances that we have here. The large black device right here is our piston pump. It's a two-action piston pump, two-stage. What we do is we pump steam into the top. The piston, there's two pistons that travel up and down, and it compresses air in the bottom, and the air is then stored in that large cylinder you see right underneath the fireman's seat, and we use that for the brakes. Okay? The smaller black device you see right there is an automatic oiler. Back in the period, the fireman's job was not only to keep this baby stoked, but to keep it oiled and greased. Sometimes they would do that obviously in the depot in between stops, and sometimes they would have to do it as the train was moving. Because if the train wasn't moving, what wasn't the railroad doing?
Earning money.
Making any money. So especially with the freight, they wanted it to continue to move. So the fireman would come out a door on a larger locomotive. You guys may be familiar with them. There would be a door here on the front. He would come out onto this catwalk, hold onto that rail, and use an oil can with a very long spout, lean over the sides and oil those vital parts as the locomotive was traveling at 40 or 50 miles an hour. Well, that led to a lot of lost firemen.
And a lot of lost
and a lot of lost oil cans. The difference being is that the next depot, you could replace your fireman because there was always somebody looking for a job. You couldn't replace that oil can. That was true. So they decided, you know what? We need to come up with an automatic oiler. So a couple of guys put their nose to the grindstone and came up with some different types of oilers. I think the phrase we use today is knockoffs. But one oiler stood out among all of them as the superior oiler. And that particular oiler was designed and manufactured by a young gentleman named Elijah McCoy. Mr. McCoy, at the end of his career, will have about 90-something patents for automatic oilers in the railroad and maritime industry. His oiler was so superior that, for instance, if you broke down and it was a fireman issue, an oiling issue, in between depots, and you didn't have the right oiler, many times you lost your job as the fireman because they blamed it on you because you didn't maintain it correctly. So the fireman always wanted the superior oiler that was available to him. So say, for instance, that last night I brought this locomotive in and I said, I need my oiler changed. And Nick was the guy working in the roundhouse last night, the mechanic. So I come in out in the morning here, the Hostler's got the engine all ready to go. I say, hey, Nick, did you change my oiler last night?
Yeah.
All right. Well, one thing I want to check here, Nick. Let me ask you. Is this a real McCoy? You're right, that's a phone. It's not a real McCoy.
That's enough.
We have a real McCoy in the back. But that's what they would say. And that phrase, how many times you use that phrase in your life? Mm-hmm. Is that the real McCoy? But that's where it came from. Because those firemen wanted to make sure that they had the real McCoy oiler. The problem with Mr. McCoy getting his product out into the railroad industry, he was African American. So they weren't accepting contributions from the African American community back then. But he got the Missouri Pacific Railroad to take on his oiler. And from there, it just grew as the superior oiler. And that's why all those firemen would come in and ask their maintenance guys, is that the real McCoy? So that's the story behind that. At least I'm sticking to it. Okay. A little bit later today, we're going to talk about these numbers. These are the production plates from the Baldwin Locomotive Works. These are not the originals. These are replicas. The originals are locked up in the Disney Family Foundation. But if you look up the archives and you look up these numbers, it tells all about our locomotives. If later today you get a chance to look at the Roger and the Walt, remember I told you they're sister locomotives? The number's off by 1 digit. So a little bit later this morning, I'm going to tell you what the significance behind those digits are. All right. Come on around the other side. A little bit different device on this side than what we saw on the other side. This unit right here. Any idea what that might be? close. Anybody? Bueller? Bueller? It's a pump. What it does, it pumps the water from the tender, pressurizes it, and puts it into the boiler first so we can make the steam. Now, the thing with a steam locomotive compared to that other dirty word diesel, right? Diesel locomotives. When you get into a diesel locomotive, you release the brake. I mean, there's a lot more to it. When you release the brake, you put the joystick forward, you go. Pull the joystick back, put the brake on your stop. This is a living, breathing thing. It is devouring itself as it's operating because it's expansion, contraction, heat, smoke, dirt, soot. But no movement, no energy on a steam locomotive is ever wasted. It's always used for something else. So remember we talked about the Stephenson's linkage, how it operates the D valves? Well, it also operates the arm that cranks the pump for the automatic boiler. And it also cranks the piston that runs this pump that pulls the water from the tender into the boiler for us. Now, the only time we can put water into the boiler with this pump is when?
They're moving.
When we're moving, right. And we're rolling down the tracks, right. Now, if we need the water now, put water in the boiler, we would have to use something called steam injection. The line you see coming down here horizontally from the cab, bends down here, is the steam injector that's on the engineer side. There's a steam injector on the fireman side also. We're going to show you those when we get up in the cab. Basically, the operation is a Venturi method, where we have steam traveling over at high velocity over another supply of water. It creates a vacuum, lifts the water, pressurizes it, and injects it into the boiler for us while we're sitting still. We can do it, like for instance, I'll be bringing this locomotive out later. When we come back tonight, as we're bringing it back here to the roundhouse, if I think there's not enough water in the boiler, I will inject as we're backing up. So we can inject where we're sitting here, going forward, backing up, wherever we need to go. We can even inject inside the roundhouse. Do the injectors always cooperate? No. They always, many times, will need some coaxing. Right? We talked about that first date, right? Treat the lady, treat her right, and then she'll take care of you, right? So we have to do the same things with these engines. I will tell you something now, you can ask any engineer here, if you don't talk nice to these locomotives in the morning, they will not work for you. She's crazy. They will not work for you. You need to talk nice to them. So, these are the lines going into the boiler. They're all backed up by check valves, so that any of the volume or pressure that we have inside the boiler is not lost back out. This device right here, this is a heat exchanger. What it does, remember I talked about the exhaust from the turbine generator? We bring it forward, run it through this device, and heat this up. Then we take the water from the pump and run it through here first before it goes into the boiler. So the water is preheated before it goes into the boiler. Remember we used number 2 diesel fuel, right? Before we put on these heat exchangers, which this was the brainstorm of George Britton, we were using a little over 30 gallons an hour of fuel. Since we have used this, we now are dropped to 22 gallons an hour. Considerable savings. Considerable savings. Nevertheless, these are some of the valves that we operate. There are 18 different valves on this locomotive that you need to know when to open, when to close, as per what type of evolution you're trying to complete. So, what we'd like to do now is, if I could break you guys up into a couple of groups, bring you up inside the cab. Again, take as many pictures as you like, especially of me.
Fantasyland Station. All passengers, please stand by to board. Monkeys, clowns, and acrobats, please report to the Big Top Supervisor.
Thank you, Beer. Sige, kita mo kayo.
Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed what you saw. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe. And ring the notification bell for updates on my future uploads.